Now, the Chronicles of Uncle Mose. World literature is filled with courtroom dramas of considerable note, but none so dramatic as the one described now by Uncle Mose.
In all the years that Skipper Bob Killick was magistrate along this shore, the shrewdest piece of court work he had to handle was the time when Uncle Sol Noddy stole the 2 holes from Skipper Lige Bartle. Now, what good, you might say, is 2 holes? Not much nowadays, since most people give up keeping dogs. But years ago, well, how else can a man set a herring net under the ice? You cut 2 holes 8 or 10 foot apart, tie a rope to one end of a flake lunger, poke it down through one hole, and hook it up through the other with a hand gaff. Oh yes, if you want to set a bigger net, you cut 3 holes, or even 4. But 2 holes was enough to serve Skipper Lige Bartle's purpose that evening he was coming home down the arm on dog team from his rabbit slips. He chopped his 2 holes, then hurried home to get his net and a flake lunger, so's to have it set and home again afore night overtook him. He didn't even stop for a bite to eat, just grabbed a pair of dry cuffs and was off again, a spry man. But spry as he was, Uncle Sol Noddy was spryer. Uncle Sol was already there, and had just finished setting his net in Lige's holes. Well, Lige ordered Sol to take that net out of his holes. Sol said they was his, 'cause he'd found them. Lige said they was his, 'cause he'd chopped them. Well, Sol said be that as it might, he owned them now, 'cause possession was 9 points of the law. Skipper Lige was a younger man than Uncle Sol, and a bigger man. And if he hadn't been a church-going man besides, he said after as how he'd a tied Uncle Sol to his own rope and reeved him down one hole and up through the other. As it was, he went home and he wired Skipper Bob Killick, the magistrate, to come immediately, or a bit quicker than that, if 'twas possible. Skipper Bob wired back that he'd come and have court work in May, when navigation opened. Public opinion was one-sided. Skipper Lige was a respectable man, whereas Uncle Sol was the worst miserable hang-ashore on the coast. And to make matters worse, Sol was doing real well with the herring, and even offered Skipper Lige a meal for his Good Friday dinner. I can't repeat Skipper Lige's answer, but it made him feel so low that he didn't have the face to go to church on Easter Sunday. Well, Pigeon Inlet School was packed for court work when Skipper Bob Killick come on his rounds in May. And he read out the charge how Uncle Sol had stolen the property of Skipper Lige, namely and to wit, 2 holes. Then Uncle Sol, instead of having the common decency to confess what he done and take what was coming, had the impudence to look the magistrate right square in the face and say he didn't know whether he was guilty or not. And what he would like to know was, what was the law concerning holes? Well, Skipper Bob was took right aback for a minute, and he said he allowed the law concerning holes was like the law concerning anything else. You mustn't steal 'em. Then Uncle Sol, brazened than ever, asked how could you steal a hole anyway? And when Skipper Bob said what did he mean, how could you steal a hole, Uncle Sol said, 'cause a hole was nothing anyway, only a hole. All this time poor Skipper Lige was there saying nothing, but swelling up like a gurnet, ready to bust. Then he said as how a hole might be nothing to the hang-ashore that stole it, but was something to the man that had to chop it. But Skipper Bob called him to order. So Lige kept quiet, but he swelled bigger, if that was possible, until Skipper Bob ruled that on his first point, Uncle Sol had lost out, and a hole was something. All right then, said Uncle Sol, I only borrowed the use of his holes, never intending to keep 'em, and now we can have 'em back again. Skipper Lige said the holes was drove out the bay when the ice went out, but Uncle Sol maintained that holes was only fresh air and water, and they was still up there in the arm, and Lige could have 'em and 10,000 welcomes. Well, Skipper Bob had to call a 15-minute recess on that, But after it was over, he come back and he ruled as how Uncle Sol was wrong, on account of how, in what he called the common law, a hole couldn't be a hole unless there was a hedge around him. Then Uncle Sol tried his last dodge. He said as how a man couldn't steal anything without shifting it from where he'd found it in the first place, and that he hadn't shifted these holes an inch. Skipper Lloyd said no, Sol hadn't shifted them, not 'cause he wouldn't, but 'cause he couldn't, and if he could have, he'd have slung the 2 holes over his back quick enough and gone off with them. Uncle Sol said, be that as it might, the fact was he hadn't shifted them, and on that point, Skipper Bob Killick, the magistrate, had to agree with him. He gave his verdict that although Uncle Sol hadn't actually stole the holes, he had trespassed on them, and he asked Uncle Sol what he had to say before a sentence was passed. Well, Uncle Sol said right cheerful like that if all he'd done was to trespass again Skipper Lodge, no doubt Skipper Lodge, as a church-going man, would be only too ready to forgive those, including Uncle Sol, who had trespassed again him. And Skipper Lodge bust right out then for sure, and he said he'd forgive Uncle Sol when Uncle Sol give him back his holes, edges and all, and with that, Skipper Bob delivered his judgment. He ordered Uncle Sol to cut 2 holes the following winter in the same place for Skipper Lodge to set his errand net in, and that was the end of it as far as the law was concerned. Of course, Uncle Sol got the best of it in the long run, but that's another story, and like Skipper Bob his own self said the following summer, after he'd heard the outcome, he doubted very much if even the Supreme Court could do much to cure a hangy-shore like Uncle Sol Noddy, 'cause he was one miserable hangy-shore, if ever there was one. Today I'm going to try to tell you about the trouble that broke out not long ago between Aunt Sophy and King David. That's Jethro Noddy's billy goat. First of all, though, I'd like to say that opinion is divided here in Pigeon Inlet as to which one of 'em is in the right. And if there could be a vote on it, I wouldn't be surprised but what King David would go in with a sweeping majority. Personally, he'd win my vote, because even though I got a high regard for Aunt Sophy, still, right is right, and wrong is no man's right. Here's another funny thing. I've read or heard somewhere how a fellow said one time that this life was like a big wheel always turning over, so that what was on top now would be sure to end up on the bottom sometime later on. Well, whoever said that never spoke a truer word. 'Cause look what's happened now. Only 2 years ago, I had cause to abuse King David for stealing me cabbages, and Aunt Sophy took his part and was on the out with me for weeks about it. Now she's mad with King David, and in all fairness, I had to take his part this time, and she's on the outs with me again. Well, here's what happened. Up till a year or 2 ago, Aunt Sophy used to keep 3 or 4 sheep. Then she give it up. Like she told me it was too much trouble for a woman when there was no man around the place. Well, ever since then, she's had a little problem about what to do with her potato scraps. She used to save 'em in a little bucket in her back porch, and every Monday morning she'd put 'em out. Well, King David got to know Monday morning just as well as if he'd had an almanac to go by. I don't know how he figured it, but he did. It wasn't by the clothes on the lines, 'cause even on rainy Mondays, he'd be there just the same. And when Aunt Sophy had put the bucket of scraps outside her back door, he'd just say whatever grace he says and dig in. Aunt Sophy said afterwards, trying to defend herself, that she usedn't to notice he was there. All she said she'd do was put out the bucket full and take it in empty an hour or two later. Well, that might be. But one thing for sure, if she didn't know, King David did. And it got so we used to look forward to it every Monday morning. Well, 3 Sunday nights ago, coming home from church, Emma Jane Bartle happened to tell Aunt Sophy how hard it was to get food for her 3 sheep. And Aunt Sophy promised to run across next morning with her bucket of potato scraps. And so next morning, with poor King David all ready to ask whatever blessing goats do ask, Aunt Sophy went right by him with the bucket, right over to Emma Jane's sheep's house. The only time she looked back was to admire her lovely wash that she had out on the line that fine Monday morning. She says she didn't even notice that King David was there. She noticed him on the way back, though. First thing she spied was the big gap in her line of clothes, where her best tablecloth had been hanging. Next thing she noticed was King David trotting off down the road, towing the tablecloth along behind him through the mud and the slush. So Aunt Sophy went wing and wing after him. I missed that part of it myself, but Sam Pryor told me afterwards that when they passed along by his place, 'twas something worth seeing. Aunt Sophy said put him in mind of the old Paulina in the song. He was looking out through the window, and he hurried and put his boots and cap to chase him. But when he got there, 'twas too late. What seems to have happened was this. Aunt Sophy got close enough to tread on the rear end of the tablecloth, and that, of course, brought King David up into the wind facing her. But he didn't let go. Well, she scooped up a mixture of mud in her hand and hove it at him. Now, any schoolboy in Pigeon Inlet could have told her that was the wrong thing to do. But by this time she'd lost her temper, and then she made the biggest mistake of all. She looked round for a rock and spied one just behind her. So she turned around to pick it up. 'Twas stuck into the ground, so while she was trying to prise it loose with her fingers, King David had plenty of time to survey the situation and figure out what he could do to vent his spite at Aunt Sophy for throwing the mud at him. Grandpa Walcott often says that an old man looks back at the happy days when he was young and wishes he could have the same chances over again. Well, I imagine the same thought was in King David's head when he viewed Aunt Sophy with her back turned, trying to pick up that rock. To him it must have looked like his happiest days had come back again, and he'd better not miss this golden opportunity. According to Sam Pryor, who was just too late to save her, King David didn't hit her hard, just nudged her enough to topple over so that the crown of her head, pin curls and all, went into the mud, and it took Sam all he could do with his brother Joe's help to straighten her up. 'Twas only then that those of us who were down at Skipper Joe's net loft found out about it, from hearing Aunt Sophy expressing her opinion of King David and Jethro Noddy and the community council and a few other things that come into her mind. Whatever trouble we might have making a Canadian out of Pete Briggs, the same can't be said about Skipper Joe Irwin. Why, even before Confederation, Skipper Joe used to say how 'twould be a good thing, even though he never seemed sure what'd be good about it. And after we got it, he figured that the higher taxes on his baccy and fishing supplies was just about offset by the family allowances for his two youngest. And for that he said he was thankful. But he wanted to be more than just thankful. He wanted to be proud. He's that kind of a man. I'll never forget the day when Skipper Joe first found something to be proud of in his new citizenship. Almost 4 years ago it was, a Sunday afternoon. We were sitting in my kitchen, just the two of us, me being a bachelor. He says he loves to come here to get away from the women and the youngsters, to find a bit of what he calls peace and quiet. He was in his stocking feet 'cause his Sunday shoe was pinched, and I happened to turn on the radio, expecting to hear a word of prayer, or perhaps a hymn, when what should we hear, Sunday and all as it was, but this hockey game, with a fellow all worked up telling us all about it, and a lot of people in the background almost as excited as he was. Yes, a hockey game. Well, in spite of it being Sunday, I didn't like to switch it off while Skipper Joe appeared interested, so we listened. And the game was between a crowd of Russians and a crowd of Canadians from British Columbia. Well, I said that as far as I was concerned, Russia and British Columbia was about the same distance from Pigeon Inlet. But Skipper Joe reminded me that 'twas Canada we'd joined up with 4 years before. So we kept on listening. And before long we found another reason for siding with the Canadians. Why, even their names sounded home-like, like our own. Now, the Russians, they had outlandish names, like Bob Off and Knock 'em Off and Push 'em Off, things like that. Whereas the Canadians, why, there was one fellow there named Warwick, spry too. And Skipper Joe said he'd be bound, why, he'd bet his compass, that fellow was related to Uncle Tom Warwick from Rumble Cove, just down the shore. Uncle Tom had a brother that went away to the harvest fields 40 years ago, and Uncle Tom is still expecting him back as soon as he saves up his passage money. But now, with his boy playing on this hockey team, it looks like he'll bide up there after all. Anyway, me and Skipper Joe found ourselves getting excited and cheering for Canada, and of course for Rumble Cove whenever this Warwick did something smart. Then they stopped to take a spell, and I said to Skipper Joe how perhaps we ought to call out to Grampa Walcott to come over and hear the game. Now, Grampa lives just across the road. He was 83 at the time, and Saturday night hockey is past his bedtime. So Skipper Joe said no, Grampa wouldn't understand it anyway. You see, Grampa's no authority on local matters like fish and weather and prices, but since Confederation, there's so much crowding in on him at once, he gets confused over what he hears from foreign parts. Like one blowy evening the fall before, he'd heard something on the radio, and he went all around Pigeon Inlet, saying how polio was spreading something awful up in the United States, 'cause he just heard 40,000 people screeching their poor heads off, barred up in a place called the polio grounds. So we decided not to disturb Grandpa, and me and Skipper Joe listened by ourselves till it was over. And the Canadians got the best of it. 5-0, I think it was. And Skipper Joe said how at last, after 4 or 5 years, he'd found something to make him downright proud to be a Canadian. But just then the door opened, and who should come in but Grandpa Walcott, all out of breath, trying to tell us what a wonderful thing he'd just heard on the radio, and how the Russians, as he called them, had given the Canadians an awful beating. Well, we tried to explain to him that it was the other way round. And Grandpa, said Skipper Joe, sure didn't you hear the announcer telling about young Warwick, Uncle Tom Warwick's nephew from Rumble Cove? Yes, said Grandpa, deed I did. And a spry young fellow he was too. Most as spry as Uncle Tom was in his prime. But, said Grandpa, he wasn't half as spry as that Russian fellow. What Russian fellow, said I. Can't recall his name, said Grandpa. 'Twas an outlandish name, anyhow. Was it Bob Off, said I. No, not he, said Grandpa. Well, then we tried him with Push 'em Off and Kick 'em Off, but he shook his head. Then, he said, Now I remember. Who, said I. Face Off, said Grampa. That was his name, Face Off. Why, said Grampa, he was 10 times sprier than young Warwick. Why, 1 minute Face Off would be down in one end, the next minute he'd be down in the other end, and before you could blink, there'd be Face Off smack out in the middle. And another thing, said Grampa, he had good wind, this Face Off. The others would have to stop every few minutes to take a spell, but he bided out there all the time. Well, there was no use trying to explain hockey to Grampa at his age, so we contented ourselves with telling him how it was his duty as a Canadian to cheer for his own side. He agreed, a bit dubiously though, and he hoped the Canadians had managed to convert Face Off and get him to be a Canadian too. He said 'cause if they kept on playing this hockey, the time had come when they'd surely need him. If there's one sure proof the times are getting more civilized than they used to be, 'tis the way business is carried on nowadays. Well, years ago, according to Grandpa Walcott, 'twas something awful. And to prove his point, a thing which Grandpa's always ready and willing to do, he tells this story about how he got the pair of swild-skin slippers that he's been wearing now for nigh on 30 year. Of course, he's had 3 new pair of soles and 2 new pair of uppers in 'em during that time, but they're the same pair of slippers. And he likes to treasure 'em because, he says, they remind him of the one and only time he ever got the better of old Josiah Bartle, who was the merchant here 30 year ago. And even then, he said, he'd never a got 'em only for a thing called algebra. And when I asked him what in the world algebra was, he said he didn't know, but it must be a wonderful fine thing sure enough, to help a poor man like him get the better of a shrewd old bird like Josiah Bartle. 'Twas long about the middle of April in 1931, says Grandpa, when Liz, his missus, that's Grandma, told him the molasses keg was empty, and he better go down to Josiah's store and get some. Grandpa wondered how he'd pay for it, 'cause 'twas too early in the spring to get credit on next summer's account, and he certainly didn't want to disturb the bit of gold he had in the sock. And 'twas then Liz reminded him of his 2 swild-skins. True, one of 'em had some shot holes in 'em, but the other was perfect, and between 'em they ought to fetch enough lassie to tide him over till credit time. So taking his empty keg and the 2 swild-skins, off he went. Now Skipper Josiah the merchant was glad to see him, business being what it was that time of the year, and told Grandpa how lassie was current price, $1 a gallon. Likewise swild-skins was current price, $1 a skin. Grandpa asked him what about shot holes. And Josiah told him they was current price too, 10 cents off for every shot hole. Well, Grampa didn't need any learning to figure he ought to get a gallon for the good skin and a part of a gallon for the shot hole he won. So when Josiah come back from the inside where he kept these swile skins and lassie and things like that, and said right friendly like, "Here you are, Ben. Here's your keg with your half-gallon of lassie." Grampa was took aback and said it ought to be more than a half a gallon. Well, Josiah rubbed his hands friendlier than ever and said no, half a gallon was exactly right. You see, he said, 2 swile skins at $1 each was $2. Then 15 shot holes in one of 'em at 10 cents a shot hole, that was $1.50. Take that off of the $2 and you had 50 cents left, and with lassie $1 a gallon, here was his half gallon. Now Grampa knowed there was something wrong. He said there was no shot hole at all in one of 'em, and he asked Josiah to give him a gallon for that one, and give him back the hole he won. But Josiah explained how he couldn't do that, 'cause the 2 skins went together in what was called in business a package deal, where the good points of the one had to offset the bad points of the other. Then Grampa wanted to call the whole thing off and go home again with his 2 skins and his empty keg. But Josiah said no. Business was business, and what was done couldn't be undone. Oh my, the business world would never know where it stood. Then Grampa made a remark, but Josiah threatened the law on him for it, so all that was left for him to do was to go home. Now when Lizzie's missus, grandma that is now, tipped up the keg that night to full the molassie dish, she noticed there wasn't much in it. So she wormed the story out of Grampa and give him 24 hours to go back to Josiah and get his rights, or else she'd do it. Course, a thing like that would disgrace Grampa completely. So he spent nearly all that night lying awake, thinking up a scheme. Next morning he had it, and he went over to Uncle Finn Pryor to get his help in carrying it out. And Uncle Finn was only too glad to do it. And so the upshot was, late that evening, Grampa visited Josiah's store, and Finn Pryor, with 2 or 3 more, had just started an argument about the big profits merchants made. They asked Grampa's opinion, and he went even further than the rest, and said yes, merchants often sold things for 10 times what they paid for 'em. Well, Josiah got mad, and he poked his snout right into the trap. He told Grampa he'd be glad to sell anything he had for 10 times what he'd paid for it. "All right then," said Grampa, "sell me back that swile skin that got the 15 shot holes in it." Well, what a hullabaloo. Everybody wanted the particulars, and they all agreed Josiah hadn't paid nothing for it. So being as how 10 times nothing was nothing, Josiah was bound by his word of a man to give it back to Grampa for nothing. Now, if Josiah had give in right then, he'd have been better off. But he couldn't bear to get the worst of it, so he said he wouldn't be guided by people with less book learning even than he had. And then who should come in but the schoolmaster? And they put the thing square up to him. And, says Grampa, 'twas the schoolmaster that brought up this business about algebra. According to algebra, said the schoolmaster, Josiah hadn't just paid nothing for the swile skin with the holes, he'd paid 50 cents less than nothing, because he took off 50 cents from the good one on account of it. Now, algebra called that a minus 50 cents, and 10 times that was a minus $5, which again, according to algebra, meant that Josiah had to give Grampa back the skin and $5 besides. Well, Josiah was fit to be tied. He said that, mark his words, algebra someday would be the ruination of business. But he give Grampa back the skin and the $5 besides, and Grampa went home happy. Liz wasn't so happy, though. She said if that was what algebra was like, 'twas no better than bingo. And she made Grampa give the $5 to the church organ fund. But she let him keep the swile skin, and that's what he made the pair of slippers out of that he wears to this very day. He calls them his Algebra Slippers, and he says that whatever algebra is, there's no doubt about it, 'tis a true friend to the poor man. After hearing the unkind remarks that Grandpa Walcott passed about the stupidity of such animals as the rabbit and the beaver, you might get the idea he's a man with no respect for dumb animals at all. But don't get him wrong. You should hear him talk about what he calls genuine animals, ones that any up-and-coming country like Canada might well be proud of to have as their national animal. Take, for example, the dog hood. Now there's an animal with character. Why, a dog hood'll sit there on a pan of ice all day long minding his own business. Leave him bide, and he'll do as much for you. But molest him, and see what happens. That is, if you live to tell about it. Grampa says he's heard tell about animals in foreign parts that have been known to fight till they're dead. But the dog hood is different. Why, he'll fight after he's dead. Skipper Lige Bartle, out spoiling one morning years ago, shot and pelted one just after daylight. And coming back that way late in the evening, the carcass of that old dog hood, he said, snapped at him. And if Skipper Lige hadn't been so yary, he'd have lost a piece off his starboard leg. Or take King David, as Jethro Noddy's billy goat. He got his name from a clergyman that was here one time, who watched that billy goat jumping fences, and christened him King David after a character in the Psalms, who used to be good at jumping over walls. And when you remember that clergyman went away from here in the First World War, it'll give you some idea about King David's age. Naturally, he's through with jumping fences now, and is what you might call past his labour. But what dignity! And even today, if you throw something at him, and then bend over with your back turned to him, like Aunt Sophy did, that time after King David took her best tablecloth off her clothesline, but that's a story in itself, and 'tis not the one I started to tell in the first place. The noblest animal of them all, says Grandpa, is the bull moose. And to prove his point, he tells the story about Skipper Jonathan Briggs, as Pete Briggs's father, and the experience he had one time with a bull moose. Now, Grandpa's not sure about the exact date. All he's sure of is that there was no war on at the time, 'cause the price of fish was low, and times were bad. So he figures 'twas between 45 and 50 years ago, when Skipper Jonathan was in his prime, the spryest man with the longest legs that Pigeon Inlet ever produced. Well, this day, according to Grandpa, Skipper Jonathan had an awful longing for meat. Naturally, of course, with times bad, there was only credit for flour and molasses, and 'twas the wrong season for turs. But he figured if he took his muzzle loader and walked the 2 mile across Gullmash into the low woods, he might spy a rabbit or something that might help keep body and soul together. So off he went, muzzle loader, powder horn, shot bag and all. Now, as everybody knows, the shore to the nor'ard between here and Hartley's harbour is awful rugged, with cliffs about 200 foot high and a sheer drop to the beach below. There's not a tree to be seen all along that stretch of cliff, except one old pine tree right on the edge, about a mile to the nor'ard of here. Nowadays, with the frost eating away the cliff every spring, that old tree is hanging out over the water, and likely to fall any time. But in those days, 'twas standing straight up right on the edge of that precipice, with the lowest limb about 20 feet off the ground. Well, according to Grandpa's story, Skipper Jonathan left Pigeon Inlet that morning, followed the dog team trail along the edge of the cliff till he got to that old pine tree. Then, taking his bearings from it, he turned off and headed straight across Gullmash towards the woods, about 2 mile back. He stopped just before he got to the scrub timber and put about 4 fingers in his muzzle loader, just about the right load for a rabbit. He put a cap on the nipple and went in, about half a gunshot, when what should he almost bump into head-on but this bull moose. For size, the like he'd never seen before or even heard tell of. And so close, he could almost reach out and touch him with the muzzle of the gun. And then, as Skipper Jonathan often admitted afterwards, he got excited and lost his head. He up-gunned and fired right into that bull moose's face, although he should have known that 4 fingers would have about the same effect on that animal as a handful of pepper. Well, the moose shook his head, gave a snort, and took towards him, and Skipper Jonathan scooted out of that clump of trees in a hurry and headed back across Gullmash with the bull moose right on his heels. The mash was dry, so Jonathan made good going, but so did the moose. Jonathan looked back once, but what he saw didn't look too pleasant, so he hove away his gun and settled down to running. He said after that he remembered seeing a rabbit or 2 on the mash, but they got out of the way to let somebody run as knowed how. And then Skipper Jonathan remembered an awful thing. He was headed straight for the cliff, with a 200-foot drop and sure death ahead of him, and that bull moose, which was even worse, right behind him. But then he thought of something else, a hope. That old pine tree, straight ahead on the edge of the cliff. But the limb, the lowest one, 20 foot off the ground. Could he jump up to it? Well, just then the moose snorted right down the back of his neck, so he opened his throttle right to the last notch. The tree was just ahead. He judged his distance, not 20 foot from the edge of the cliff, and he jumped, with his hands above his head and his fingers stretched out, hoping to clutch that limb. Did he clutch it, says Grampa? No. Sad to say, he missed it. Missed it on the way up, that is, but fortunately he grabbed it on the way down. And that bull moose went through the air below him like he was shot from a gun, and tumbled right down among the rocks in the landwash. And Skipper Jonathan worked his way along that limb to the trunk of the pine tree, got down on the ground, and had that moose dressed and brought home to Pigeon Inlet in a boat before dark that evening. That animal, said Grampa, dressed 1,100 pounds, and the authorities in St. John's, when they heard it, reported to him, wired Skipper Jonathan to distribute the meat among the poor families of Pigeon Inlet. Well, said Grampa, everyone is poor at a time like that, so it was cut and come again in every house in Pigeon Inlet for the next week or 2. What a animal. Killed awful, too. Yes, said Grampa, if I had my way, the bull moose would be the national animal of Canada, and every Pigeon Inletter would be proud then to be a Canadian. Tall are the tales that fishermen tell when summer's work is done. Of fish they caught, of birds they've shot, of crazy risks they've run. But never did a fisherman tell a tale so tall be a half a mile, as Grandpa Walcott told that night in the smokeroom on the Kyle. With baccy smoke from 20 pipes the atmosphere was blue. There was many a have another, boy, and don't mind if I do, when somebody suggested that each in turn should spin a yarn about some circumstance he'd personally been in. Then tales were told of gun barrels bent to shoot around the cliff, of men thawed out and brought to life that had been frozen stiff, of bark pots carried off by flies, of pathways chopped through fog, of Uncle Bill who barefoot kicked the knots from a 12-inch log. The loud applause grew louder when Uncle Mickey Shea told of the big potato he'd growed in Gander Bay. Too big to go through the cellar door, it lay at rest nearby, until one rainy night that fall, the pig drowned in its eye. But meanwhile in a corner, his grey head slightly bowed, sat Grampa Walcott, 84, the oldest of the crowd. Upon his weather-beaten face there beamed a quiet grin, when someone shouted, "Grandpa, 'tis your turn to chip in." "Boys, leave me out," said Grandpa. "Thanks, don't mind if I do." "Well, all right, boys, if you insist. I'll tell you one that's true. It's a story about jigging squids I'm going to relate that happened in Pigeon Inlet in 1888. Me, I was just a bedlamer, a-fishing with me dad, and prospects for the summer were looking awful bad. The Capelin scull was over, it hadn't been too bright, and here was August come and gone, and nar a squid in sight. Day after day we searched for squids till dark from the crack of dawn. We dug up clams and cocks and hens till even these were gone, and still no squids. So in despair we give it up for good, and took our gear ashore and went a-cutting firewood. Well, one morning we were in the woods with all the other men, and wondering if we'd ever see another squid again. Father broke his axe that day, so we were the first ones out, and as we neared the landwash, we heard the women shout, "Come hurry, boys, the squids is in." We jumped aboard our boat and started out the harbour, the only crew afloat. But soon our keel begun to scrunch like scraping over skids. "Father," says I, "we've run aground." "Me son," says he, "the squids." Says he to Jigger, "Haven out," and quick as a flash I did, and soon as it struck the water, 'twas grappled be a squid. I hauled him in, and what do you think? Just as he crossed the rail, I'm blessed if there wasn't another squid clung to the first one's tail, and another clung to that one, and so on in a string. I tried to shake 'em loose, but Father said, "You foolish thing, you've got something was never seen before in Newfoundland. So drop the jigger, grab the string, and pull hand over hand." I pulled that string of squids aboard till the boat could hold no more. Then we hitched it in the risings and rowed for the shore. The crews were coming from the woods, they'd heard the women bawl, but Father said, "Don't hurry, boys, we've squids enough for all." So Uncle Jimmy took the string until he had enough, then neighbour-like he handed it on to Skipper Levi Cuff. From stage to stage that string was passed throughout the whole night long, till daylight found it on Eastern Point with Uncle Billy Strong. Now Uncle Bill, quite thoughtfully before he went to bed, took 2 half-hitches of that string round the grump on his stage head. Next morning Hartley's harbour heard the news, and up they come in a trap skiff with 3 pair of oars to tow the string down home. When Hartley's harbour had enough the following afternoon, that string went on from place to place until it reached Carpoon. Now what happened to it after that I don't exactly know, but people say it crossed the straits and ended in Fort Howe. Yes, tall are the tales that fishermen tell when summer's work is done, of fish they've caught, of birds they've shot, of crazy risks they've run. But never did a fisherman tell a tale so tall be a half a mile, as Grandpa Walcott told that night in the Smokeroom on the Kyle.